going to revisit some of the aspects of the impacts of climate change, but the focus is very much on government intervention in the impacts of climate change, and that is known as adaptation. So what is adaptation? Essentially it is people, companies, governments, civil services changing their behavior to achieve two things. One, to alleviate the negative impacts of climate change, and second, to make most of the positives. So one immediate consequence of adaptation is that the impacts of climate change are not nearly as bad as they otherwise would have been. And the implication of that is, of course, that there's less need to worry about climate change and less need to reduce your emissions. Vice versa, if you reduce your emissions by more, then of course climate change is less bad and you need to adapt less. So at a strategic policy level, adaptation and mitigation are substitutes. If you do more of the one, you need to do less of the other. There's people out there who confuse the word substitute and they think that substitutes are complements. They really are not. At a policy level, these things are strategic substitutes. Now, for a long time, talking about adaptation to climate change was seen as admitting defeat on greenhouse gas emission reduction. And for a long time, adaptation was sort of not talked about as being politically incorrect. But at some point, people began to realize that you cannot avoid climate change altogether. And then later on, people began to realize that the international climate policy efforts were not nearly as ideal as initially hoped. And now, policymakers are paying attention to adaptation. And there's a second component to that, and that is that if you want to seriously reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then as a single country you can jump up and down whatever you want. Serious greenhouse gas emission reduction requires some form of collaboration or coordination. It just doesn't work if others don't play. Whereas adaptation is something that is largely within the control of an individual government. And as it became clearer and clearer that many other countries are not very serious about greenhouse gas emission reduction, of course, every country takes itself very seriously in its climate policy, but it's beginning to become clear that you shouldn't take other countries so seriously. Adaptation is actually much more firmly on the policy agenda than it used to be. So before talking about adaptation policy, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to adapt. What does this actually entail? And I'm going to try and make the point that adaptation is actually fairly simple unless we are dealing with long-lived water-related infrastructure. And it should be clear that the uncertainty about future climate change is fairly large. And this is just a range of projections about where the global mean surface air temperature would go. And over the century it can warm anything from 1 degree to 6 degrees. And if you want to know what will the climate be in the year 2100, we are actually pretty certain it will be different from what it is today, but we cannot really predict what it will be. Now, does that matter? Does that matter if you're a farmer planting wheat? Not really, because wheat has a growing season of 3 months. And what matters for the success of your harvest is the weather over the next 3 months. Not the weather over the next century. That's completely irrelevant. And by the time that you're a farmer in the year 2080, you will have learned a whole lot more about what climate change will be like. And still, by that time, presumably, the growing season of wheat is roughly 3 months. So in 2080, what matters is the weather over the next 3 months. And that is much more certain than the weather in 100 years' time. So for the sort of decisions that have very short-term consequences, the uncertainty about climate change doesn't really matter. Because what matters is the implications of the decisions you're making now. And planting decisions can be revised every couple of months. So it's only if you start building things that will last for a long time that the uncertainty about future climate change begins to matter a lot. So if you're building a bridge, for instance, a bridge needs to open and close because it needs to let the ships through and needs to let the cars run over. Those things are supposed to last for decades. There have been instances during very hot weather that either the bridge wouldn't open, and it creates an enormous traffic jam on the canal, with all the boats not being able to go through. And there's also been incidences during very hot weather where the bridge was open but it could not close anymore. And that is of course because steel expands when it gets hotter, and then the mechanics of the bridge just don't work anymore, and if the bridge can't close, then you create a big traffic jam with the cars that want to use the road. For those sort of decisions, you actually do need to look into the future, because you need to design the bridge such that it will function, or most likely function, over its lifetime. And then, if you're building a bridge now, and it's to last half a century, then you need to take into account that in the future it may be a little bit hotter or a lot hotter. And you need to build that into your design. Now that is relatively simple, because for temperature, that is what matters for bridge design, you know the sign of the change. You know it will get warmer, and you just need to build in a tolerance, and your best bet is probably to go for the most pessimistic scenario there. But if we are talking about water infrastructure, things become a lot more hairy. I've shown you this picture before, and I told you that in the so blue means wetter, red means drier, and in the shaded areas 2/3 of the models agree on the sign of the change. And what you see here is that in large parts of the world we know that future rainfall will be different than today's rainfall, but we actually don't know whether it will get drier or wetter. And in some parts of the world, including England, we know that it will be wetter in winter and drier in summer. But the uncertainty, or there's a fair amount of uncertainty about by how much. So if you're building long-lived infrastructure in the water sector, it's not just that you need to design your system such that it works in a future climate, but also you don't know what that future climate will be. You only know that it will be different from what it is today. And if you worry about future winters being wetter, then what you would do is you would dredge your rivers and your canals so that the water flows faster to the sea. That will be an obvious solution to flood risks in winter. The problem with that solution is that if the water flows faster in winter, it will also flow faster in summer, and thus exacerbating the drought that you are likely to suffer more of in summertime. So that cannot be a solution, right? That's a solution to the winter problem, but not to the summer problem, vice versa. The obvious solution to drought problems in summertime would be to slow the water down, to keep the water for longer in the river and don't let it wash into the sea, which would help in summer but not in winter. So what you need to do is come up with some sort of intervention in your water management such that you solve both problems at the same time. And you're probably talking about retention of water either in urban areas or in agricultural areas, because of the uncertainty about the size of the effect, as well as the sign of the effect in some cases. Really what you need to do is make the whole system more robust. Just pour more concrete so that it can stand anything. That would be one solution. And the other, perhaps, or definitely in some cases, better solution is to make the whole system more flexible. To design your buildings, your road infrastructure, your water infrastructure, such that it can be easily changed if you learn more about what the future will be like. And these things can be done. If you ask engineers to do this, they get all excited, because that is a challenge to engineers. It may be very costly. maybe very costly. But you need to, because you don't know what the future will bring, and you do know that your system will have to function in 50 years' time still, you need to build in this extra robustness, this extra flexibility to cope with whatever climate may throw at you. And I mean, the Thames barrier is one example of both robustness and flexibility. It's flexible in the sense that it's not a permanent closure. Valves that go up and down, and they go up if there's a tidal surge. So you have protection when you need it, but you don't have protection when you don't need it. So that it's flexible, and it's also more robust. And this was actually nothing to do with sea level rise or climate change. It has to do with engineers as being generally risk averse. When the Thames barrier was originally designed, they just built it such that it could withstand a meter of sea level rise, just to make sure. Nobody was worried about sea level rise when they built it, but they just added a meter of concrete to everything, just to be sure. And actually those sort of interventions, compared to the cost of designing the thing and building the thing, to just add a meter of concrete is actually a fairly small increase in cost. Definitely much, much easier than 20 years later go back and add that meter of concrete when you're doing it, when you're building it. It's actually a fairly small increase in cost, and that is why engineers do this sort of stuff. So this can be done, but you need to think about it. But I want to emphasize that this only matters for things that are supposed to last for decades or longer. And it's particularly important if it's for water, because we don't know what the future of rainfall will bring. For other systems, and I've shown you this before, the system renews itself so rapidly, like the population on a beach lasts a few hours, you don't need to worry about what the future will be, right? You only need to worry about what the next 2 hours will bring if you're sunbathing on the beach. So let's return to public policy. The realization that we cannot avoid all climate change led to a realization that there needs to be adaptation to climate change. And this is often led by national governments. And all governments around the world are formulating or have formulated national adaptation plans. And this is actually one of the things that was successfully negotiated on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that there is an obligation in international law that there is such a national adaptation plan. Multilateral organizations, the United Nations itself and its agencies, as well as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank, are all also formulating international adaptation plans. And one of the other things that has been agreed under the UNFCCC is that there will be some sort of finance from rich countries to poor countries to sort of support their adaptation. This can be seen sort of as a moral obligation and sort of a compensation that the rich have emitted most of the carbon dioxide emissions, the poor will suffer most of the consequences. So it is sort of a moral duty for us to support them in avoiding the worst of the impacts of climate change. It is also can be interpreted as a bribe to keep them at the table in the international climate negotiations. So that is why this was done. Because adaptation is relatively new, and because there are these multilateral funds being organized, this has created quite a bonanza for consultants, because essentially the civil service was asked to do something that they haven't done before ever, namely to formulate a national adaptation plan. And the civil service, if it's being asked to do something that it hasn't done before, it's naturally instinctive to hire consultants to tell them how to do it. And the monies that are floating around are quite substantial. And here we're looking at official development aid. So what we're looking at here is official development aid from OECD countries, from the rich countries. It includes China going back to 1990 and sort of see the streams of money. And the orange Brown is sort of your conventional development aid. Education for girls and establishing the rule of law and all those sort of things. And then in green, you're looking at those monies that are spent to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in blue, you're looking at those monies that are spent on developing or helping countries adapt to climate change. About a fifth of all development aid is now diverted towards climate, and about $10 billion per year is now diverted towards adaptation to climate change. And you immediately see sort of the light going on in the eyes of a lot of consultants. Yay, there's 10 billion that they don't know what to do with. Let's advise them. And some people make a very nice living out of this. And the question then, of course, pops up: how is this money spent? And is this money spent wisely? And who is making the decisions here? And a lot of the things we talked about last week, where we discussed the relative vulnerabilities of rich and poor countries, actually suggests that a lot of the worst impacts of climate change are actually symptoms of underdevelopment. And we discussed adaptive capacity and all the things that determine adaptive capacity. And they lastly coincide with your standard development policy. And what we see now is that a lot of the money that used to be spent on ordinary development aids is now being diverted towards climate purpose. And if you look at some of the things that are going on with that money, you actually wonder why and how. One sort of example there is these projects and the money on which it's being spent is something as follows. So people worry about agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. It's very vulnerable to climate change. There's no doubt about that. And as a form of helping these poor farmers adapt to climate change, USAID has seen fit to give $300 million to NASA to shoot up a satellite that studies the weather in sub-Saharan Africa. And then it has reserved another 10 million or so for Western consultants to travel around Africa to teach the farmers that they should pay attention to the weather forecast. And if those farmers did not realize, did not know that the weather is important for their crops. And this is sort of reminiscent of the way we did development aid in the 50s and the 60s, right? So the money actually goes to Western consultants rather than to the money to the people who actually are poor. And the idea is that we will tell them what to do. There's some sort of bureaucrat, in this case in Washington DC, who decides what is good for farmers in Africa. If you look at agriculture in Africa, I mean, the impacts of climate change, the worst impacts that are predicted for sub-Saharan Africa, what climate change will do to them is that crops would fall by about half. That is, yields would be cut in two, which is a pretty serious impact if that would happen. Now, if you look at what is going on in particularly subsistence agriculture in Africa, you would find that the yield gap is a factor of 10. The yield gap is the difference between what a model farm gets in terms of the yield of cassava and wheat and maize and barley and all those things that they grow there. And then if you compare what a model farm would get using existing technology, working on the same soil with the same people in the same climate, to what subsistence farmers get, model farms get 10 times as much out of a piece of ground, piece of soil, as the average subsistence farmer does. So if we just bring subsistence farmers to the current state of the art, their yields would go up by 10, and if we then impose climate change, it would come down by 5 of that, by half, right? So there would still be a lot better off. And then if you ask yourself, so why do subsistence farmers in Africa so poorly? compared to what they could have done, compared to where the state of the art is, the answer is not they can't forecast the weather, they need a satellite up there and a Western consultant to explain to them what satellite data mean. No, it has to do with such things as access to the capital market, access to markets, being able to borrow money because you have secure tenure on your land. And that is not what is being funded with this development money. This money does not go into establishing land registries. No, it goes to shooting satellites in the sky and employing people in Boulder to look at those satellite things. So a lot of that is sort of the old development aid. You can of course wonder why there is government involvement in adaptation in the first place. And I'm going to exercise that with the example of heat waves. It's very hot out. What do you need to do? You need to wear little clothes. You need to stay calm. You need to drink a lot. But no alcohol, because alcohol opens your pores and evaporates more water. More moisture, you need to drink water and those sort of things. And you need to keep out of the sun. Now this is the sort of things that your mother should have taught you. And if you have very young children, you will realize that children that are 3 or 4, sometimes 5, don't realize this, don't make the connection between the clothes they wear and how hot they are. But sort of once you're past that, you do know these things, right? You should know these things. English people do not necessarily know that you need to keep out of the sun if it's very hot, but most other people do know that. And there is no role for government in there at all, right? This is something that is in your own interest, something you should know. There may be a bit of a role of government in that they may want to run an awareness campaign. If it's hot, stay out of the sun, sort of information, but experience shows that these awareness campaigns are actually a waste of money and don't establish a whole lot. These are just things that are in your own self-interest. David Cameron should stay out of this. This is just pure private. And the same is true for farmers deciding what seeds to plant and so on and so forth. People deciding how much energy to use in winter and in summer. Those things are private decisions, and it's in our own self-interest to make the right decisions. It is not to say that all adaptation is private. There are collective elements to this. As I said yesterday, siestas are actually a very good adaptation to hot conditions. Sleeping through the heat of the day actually makes a lot of sense, makes a lot more sense than exerting yourself during the hottest time of the day. And the same is true for late dinners. Actually, you spend a lot of energy digesting what you eat, and it makes much more sense to do that during the coolness of the night than to do it during the heat of the day. So you just get hotter then. So siestas and late dinners are a perfect adaptation to hotter circumstances. But these things sort of have a social and a collective element. You trying to sleep through the heat of the day doesn't make a whole lot of sense if there are classes scheduled between noon and 4, right? And you should reschedule classes in the future. The same is true for late dinners. That is something that you coordinate with friends and family, and it doesn't make it's possible, but it's probably not working very well if you on your own decide to shift your dinner towards midnight rather than at 6 or at 7 or wherever you eat, right? So there is a collective, a social element to these things. Not the government element, right? It's not for the government to say when you should eat your dinner. That is something you should make up between you and your friends and family. There is social elements, but most of it is private. This is not to say that there is no public involvement at all. And I'm going to illustrate that with what happened in France around the year 2003 and what happened in the US a decade earlier. And in the 2003 heat wave that hit most of Europe, but it was concentrated in France, 43,000 people died of heat stroke and related issues. 43,000 people died, which is quite a lot. And the question is, what happened? And how come? And how can it be that a country like France, which is so very well organized and so highly developed, how can 43,000 people die because of anything? Simple reason was that the heat wave was in August. And in August, people are on holiday in France, including a great many nurses and doctors. And what happened was that people presented themselves with symptoms of heat stroke and related issues to the hospitals and to the GPs and so on and so forth. And the hospitals were simply overwhelmed because they did not have enough staff. Now that is one thing. In 2003, France did not have a heat wave plan. They did not know what to do. The people who were in the hospital knew they had to call back the nurses and doctors from holiday, but they did not have the authority to do so. And the only person who had the authority to do so was the Minister of Health, and the Minister of Health was on holiday as well, and did not bother to read the newspapers that thousands of people were dying in his country, and it was his responsibility. The only person who could call back people from holiday did not do so. They've changed this, and not just in France. The UK now also has a heat wave plan or a heat plan. They've learned from this, and by now there are procedures in place that if such an event were to occur again, God forbid, then there is a plan in place to make sure that the healthcare system can cope. And this is because healthcare is arranged publicly in France. This is a clear task of the government. Right? And the UK actually also learned lessons from what happened in France. Other things happened as well, and now we're in Chicago, actually, in 1995, if I'm not mistaken. One way to keep cool during a heat wave is to turn on the air conditioning. A lot of poor people don't have air conditioning, and what you can then do is you can go to the shopping mall, because shopping malls do have air conditioning. And what happened during the 1995 heat wave in California, in Chicago, is that a lot of poor people went to the shopping mall to stay cool. But security personnel was instructed to remove anybody from the shopping mall who was not obviously shopping, including all those paupers who were there to keep cool, and they just threw them back onto the street. And a lot of them died as a result later. So what you need to do there is change, during heat waves, have exceptions. And I mean, the people who are security guards are not the best educated and not the smartest people, so you actually need to give them very clear instructions that if the temperature hits 100 Fahrenheit, then don't throw out people, just let them stay and cool off a bit. So that is obviously something that you can do. Some shopping malls have changed their policy, others no. Also what they found in both Chicago and Philadelphia was they found people living in, people essentially dying in their house because of the heat, and they did not open their windows. And you really wonder why, right? Because just opening a window would bring a bit of relief from the cold. And they actually also asked some of the people who did survive, and the answer was, but we're afraid of crime. If I open my window, anybody can come in. And they'd rather take the risk of succumbing to the heat than being the victim of violent crime. So the public response there is to have more police officers on the street during heat waves. Again, a public response. You would actually want to have more police officers on the street during heat waves anyway, because people get more irritable and more irrational during heat. And you actually see a sharp spike in violent crime as well as in sexual crime during heat waves. And that is because people lose self-control, and if you have an annoying neighbor, and when it's cool outside you have an annoying neighbor, when it's hot outside you actually go knock them over the head. And for that reason as well, you just want more officers on the street during these periods. Again, a public response. Another thing they found during the heat waves in Philly and Chicago is that there were a lot of people who died because of the heat, but actually did have fans and they did have air conditioners. They just did not turn them on because they could not afford the electricity. And there the public response would be, during these periods, to subsidize electricity to at least this part of the population, to make sure that nobody makes the decision not to turn on their fan, run the risk of dying because they cannot afford the 10 or 20 pounds that it takes to cool your house. All of this suggests that there is a role for the government in this, right? And in these cases, public intervention complements private adaptation. And then there's also examples where adaptation is just a public good. And coastal defense is one. If you are a coastal, if you own a piece of land on the coast, then it doesn't make a lot of sense for you to build a dike on the sea or on the river if your neighbors don't, because then the water just flows around it, right? And it's much more expensive to build a dike around your property than to build a linear dike collectively with all your neighbors. So coastal protection is a public good, and in most countries it is actually firmly the responsibility either of the national authority or the local authorities, depending on the constitutional arrangement. The same is true for providing irrigation water. It's again a large collective. Farmers would benefit from the infrastructure, and this is often treated as a public good, even though strictly in economic terms it's more a collective good than a public good. And the same is true for agricultural extension, so the advice that is given to farmers about when to plant and what to plant and when to harvest and what to spray, and so on and so forth. For historical reasons, this sort of advice to farmers is financed from the public purse, even though farmers are sort of small enterprises. They get a lot of free advice from the government, or funded by the government. That's known as agricultural extension. Hairdressers are also small companies that could also do with a bit of advice, but they typically don't get this subsidized by the taxpayer, but farmers do. They're much better lobbyists. And in those countries in the world where agricultural extension is seen as public goods, and basically every country on the planet, there of course also the extension bureaus, part of the civil service, needs to be told that they should change their advice because of climate change, right? Now there's also aspects of public policy that are actually positively hinder adaptation. And this is known in the literature as maladaptation. That is actually doing things that make you worse off. Staying with agriculture, the system of subsidies as well as trade policies that we have for agriculture actively hinder adaptation. And if you look at the subsidies for agriculture in Europe, they serve two purposes. One, and that is not limited to Europe, but you would see the same in Australia, you would see the same in Brazil, you would see the same in the US, is that there's a lot of subsidies or market interventions that are really there to shield farmers from market volatility. That is, the support for farmers goes up if the market is bad and it goes down if the market is good, which is a form of insurance, and you can make rational arguments that it's a good thing. The problem with this is, of course, that if the market is bad not because of a weather shock, but because of detrimental climate change, you mute the signal. Because if it's just a weather shock and next year will be better, then farmers should just continue what they're doing. But if this is a systematic deterioration in farming conditions for a particular crop or what have you, then of course farmers should start doing different things with their land, plant different crops, plant them differently, or move out of farming altogether. And the system of subsidies actually mutes that market signal. And then in Europe, less so in other countries apart from Japan, a lot of subsidies for agriculture are actually there to equalize farmers' incomes across the world. or across the jurisdiction. And essentially this is a policy that rewards people for doing stupid things. So a lot of European subsidies go to farmers who grow things where they really should not be growing things because the slopes are too steep, or the soil is too rocky, or the climate is lousy. But the purpose of these subsidies is to have all farmers in Europe, or at least within a country, roughly the same income, and that includes the farmers who do smart things, who grow the right crops on fertile soils, and they should have the same income roughly as farmers who do stupid things, that is, grow the wrong crop on the wrong soil in the wrong climate. And this, of course, also mutes the signal of rewarding people for doing things they shouldn't be doing. And then, of course, international trade policy further shields farmers from market signals, and the World Trade Organization has actually not made a lot of inroads in agricultural trade. And for instance, we are heavily subsidizing, you guys don't pay tax, but I do. So I am heavily subsidizing rice farming in Spain. They just can't compete with rice in Thailand or Vietnam or whatever. But we have raised the tariff laws so that people can grow rice in Spain. They shouldn't, right? Now, this has nothing to do with climate change, but in the future, trade policy would again mute the signal. What you would want as an adaptation to climate change is that you would shift your crop growing to where it is best suited, climate-wise, soil-wise, and so on and so forth, and not say, but it has to be grown in our country. And that is, of course, what protection is about. And all of these perverse signals lock farmers into their current crop choices, their current management practices, whereas under climate change they should start doing things differently.